The devastation wasn't Marcus walking out on me for his ex-wife, Veronica. It was the moment he stood in the living room I designed and demanded money. He needed capital for their new multi-million-dollar tech startup, so I had to sell the house immediately. He casually demanded 50% of the appreciation value, claiming his presence for 8 years justified the split. It wasn't heartbreak, it was the cold, psychological violence of having the man I supported treat my life's work as his personal ATM. That was the instant I knew the man I married was a thief. Before we jump into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach and connect with amazing viewers like you. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next surprising turn in our journey. Now, get comfortable and let's dive into a tale that will leave you inspired and intrigued. I am Anya, and this house, this beautiful, modern sanctuary was my masterpiece, my most powerful design statement. It was where every detail of lighting, every choice of stone, and every piece of custom millwork spoke of my success as an interior architect and my unwavering dedication to stability. For 8 years, Marcus, my husband, had glided through these rooms, charming my clients at dinner parties and speaking vaguely of the big business ventures he was about to launch, all while comfortably existing within the financial ecosystem I had created for us. I provided the structure, the money, and the security. He provided the potential, which, as I would soon discover, was a currency long past its expiration date. The devastation wasn't Marcus walking out on me for his ex-wife, Veronica. It was the moment he stood in the living room I designed and demanded money. He needed capital for their new multi-million-dollar tech startup, so I had to sell the house immediately. He casually demanded 50% of the appreciation value, claiming his presence for 8 years justified the split. It wasn't heartbreak, it was the cold, psychological violence of having the man I supported treat my life's work as his personal ATM. That was the instant I knew the man I married was a thief. I didn't cry or scream. I simply set the delicate plaster sample down with a precise, almost clinical click. The sound was swallowed by the high ceilings of the living room, a space that was entirely a product of my vision and my labor. I absorbed the sheer brazen audacity of his entitlement, recognizing with chilling clarity that I was not dealing with a wounded lover seeking solace, but an elegant, professional thief trying to monetize my pain and my expertise. He had watched me spend 2 years meticulously overseeing the renovation, fighting contractors, and pouring every ounce of my profit into this structure, only to now claim half of the resulting equity because he'd shared a bed and a mailing address. I looked him dead in the eye and said, my voice steady as steel, "Let's handle this through the attorneys. Marcus, effective immediately." He misinterpreted my composure as compliance, the emotional weakness he always projected onto my logical nature, and that was his first and most catastrophic mistake. He smiled, a shallow, self-satisfied flash of white teeth, and left the room to pack his single, oversized suitcase. The silence that fell after he disappeared up the stairs was not empty. It was pregnant with the enormous, terrible relief of finality and the metallic taste of betrayal. The house, once a comforting envelope of warmth, suddenly felt like a crime scene, every expensive fixture a reminder of his quiet parasitism. I couldn't bear to look at the custom island in the kitchen where he'd often sat, drinking the expensive coffee I bought, while critiquing the ambition of my latest commercial project. That same afternoon, I was sitting across from Miss Sterling, my divorce attorney. She was a sharp-witted woman, mid-50s, whose reputation was built on forensic financial detail rather than courtroom theatrics. She didn't offer tissues or platitudes. She offered a legal pad and a pen. I cut straight to the core, his demand for the appreciation value of the house, a house purchased entirely before our marriage with funds I inherited, and completely redesigned using only funds from my corporate account. His demand is absurd. Anya, but predictable, Miss Sterling said. Her fingers steepled on the desk. However, his confidence suggests he believes he holds leverage. Where would he find that? I shook my head slowly, my gaze fixed on a distant point. He has no leverage against the house deed, but he's always been obsessed with my corporate account. He often criticized me for keeping Anya Designs LLC finances separate from our joint accounts, calling it untrusting. I realize now that separation was my unconscious self-preservation. I instructed Miss Sterling to ignore our joint accounts, which were modest and predictable, and focus exclusively on the statements from my corporate entity, the one Marcus had no direct signatory rights to and believed was entirely too complicated for him to understand. I signed the release forms, granting her team access to the full financial history, feeling the cold certainty that the deeper we dug, the uglier the truth would be. The initial report from Miss Sterling's forensic team arrived 3 days later. The digital file was terse, clinical, and devastatingly precise. The investigation revealed that Marcus hadn't just been preparing to leave me. He had been actively embezzling, systematically stealing funds from my private business to finance his new life. Under the guise of legitimate business expenses, Ms. Sterling discovered a sustained pattern of suspiciously timed invoices totaling $75,000 over the last 6 months. The money had been routed through a series of shell accounts and finally labeled with the cryptic, non-existent service description, Project Management System Design Consultation Fees. It was sophisticated enough to bypass a simple tax audit, but utterly transparent to a determined forensic accountant. The timeline coincided perfectly with his renewed contact with Veronica and their planning for the green tech startup. This changes everything, Anya," Ms. Sterling stated in our follow-up call. Her voice held a note of professional satisfaction. "This is no longer just a divorce settlement. This is marital asset fraud combined with corporate theft. He has essentially stolen working capital from your corporate entity. We can move from simple division of assets to aggressive asset recovery and criminal compensation." The emotional pain of his betrayal was now channeled entirely into a surge of cold, focused, strategic energy. I was an architect of environments, and Marcus had just given me a massive structural defect to fix. The house was no longer a home I had lost. It was the staging ground for a meticulous surgical counterattack. Miss Sterling moved quickly, establishing a definitive legal claim for the theft and setting up a legal asset offset for the stolen $75,000. My goal was not simply to divorce him, but to completely neutralize his financial standing and protect my own professional reputation. The strategy dictated that any personal property of Marcus's remaining in the house would be claimed by my business entity as collateral to cover the debt he owed my LLC. For the next week, the house was silent, heavy with the pre-storm quiet. Marcus was packed and waiting for the perfect moment for me to drive him to Veronica's apartment. He continued to smile patronizingly, making comments about how he was relieved I was being so mature about the split. I let him talk, spending my days in the garage, methodically implementing the asset seizure plan. I performed the grim task of preparing his final exit with clinical detachment. I inventoried his most prized possessions, the custom-tailored suits, the vintage Swiss watches, the expensive electronics he kept locked away, and under the guidance of Miss Sterling, formally transferred the legal ownership of these items to my company. They were now classified as collateral assets, used to settle the debt he owed my LLC. I left him the absolute essentials, a few changes of clothing, and a basic toiletry kit, all packed into a single, modest carry-on bag I had purchased specifically for the occasion. All the items he would actually need to make an impression on Veronica's investors: the custom luggage, the high-end golf clubs. The designer shoes were marked as retrieved by LLC and were nowhere to be found. The true masterpiece of my planning was the subtle staging of his remaining belongings. I hired an upscale moving service, not for the delicate furniture, but for the rest of his miscellaneous effects: the old papers, the books, the things I simply didn't want in my home anymore. I calculated the exact moment the truck would arrive at the highway storage facility. The only item I drove with him, besides his small carry-on, was a single, heavy, and unassuming cardboard box I had labeled with cold irony, "Marcus, Sentimental Marriage Mementos." He joked about how sweet I was to save his memories. He was utterly oblivious that the box was filled, not with photos, but with the complete financial paper trail of his stolen $75,000, now organized and ready for legal submission. The day came for the final drive. I climbed into the driver's seat of my SUV, Marcus riding shotgun with the self-satisfied air of a man who believed he was finally escaping his limitations. He spoke nonstop about Veronica's visionary genius and the inevitable success of their green tech venture, barely acknowledging the silence I maintained. I focused on the road, on the traffic, on anything but his arrogant chatter, mentally rehearsing the timeline. We arrived at Veronica's luxurious high-rise apartment complex. Marcus stepped out, radiating entitlement. I pulled his single, sad suitcase and the mementos box from the trunk, just as he was fumbling with the security code. Veronica opened the door, poised to embrace her conquering hero. Then, my elegant move unfolded. A large plain white van, not a moving truck, pulled up to the curb, a woman in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and sensible shoes, carrying a leather portfolio, stepped out. She was the Notary Public who Miss Sterling had hired for the specific purpose of public documentation. She bypassed me, bypassed Veronica, and addressed Marcus directly. The Notary Public presented him with a document and, in a clear professional voice that carried across the quiet, affluent street, asked him to sign a declaration confirming that he was voluntarily and permanently vacating his official marital residence, a crucial legal step designed to kill any future claim of abandonment or undue pressure on my part. The most shocking moment was when, immediately after he signed, she presented him with the single thin, blue envelope from Miss Sterling. It contained the cease and desist order protecting my LLC and a notice confirming that his demand for 50% of the home's appreciation was invalid and considered nullified due to his documented financial misconduct. The order also informed him that his remaining possessions had been transferred to a storage facility, the key to which was attached to the notification. Veronica's face, witnessing her future business partner being served legal papers by an uninvited process server, transitioned from triumphant anticipation to calculative horror in an instant. She looked at the carry-on, the cheap suit he was wearing, and the blue legal envelope, realizing she had just welcomed a man who was not only broke but potentially facing a legal recovery action for corporate theft. Marcus was left standing there with one suitcase, publicly exposed and empty-handed right at the threshold of his supposed new life. I simply nodded once at the Notary Public, a silent acknowledgement of a job perfectly executed, and drove away. In my rearview mirror, I could see Veronica angrily gesticulating, pushing Marcus further back into the shadows of her doorway. The silence in the car was now truly my own, a sound of glorious, reclaimed peace. The suburban gossip network, always more efficient than any news service, went into overdrive. Veronica, a woman whose entire identity revolved around networking and reputation, reacted not with emotional fury, but with swift, brutal business logic. A man who steals $75,000 from his wife's private company is not an entrepreneur. He's a liability. She ordered him out of her apartment complex immediately, demanding he clean up his legal mess before associating with her brand. Marcus ended up retrieving his few remaining possessions from the storage unit before the first week was out and was rumored to have moved into a cramped, depressing studio apartment near the highway, the kind of place that advertised affordable weekly rates on faded billboards. 2 weeks after the incident, my mother, Eleanor, arrived, carrying her signature lemon pound cake and the determined expression of a woman who was done with polite condolences. She found me working on new design sketches in the sunroom, meticulously detailing the plans to convert Marcus's old office into a private library. "You look thin," she said, her standard greeting regardless of my actual appearance. We sat down, and she poured tea into the delicate china cups I had received as a wedding gift. Then she spoke, her voice quiet and steady, her gaze holding mine. "Your father wasn't my first husband." I nearly dropped my mug, the shock of the revelation hitting me with unexpected force. In 30 years, she had never uttered a word of this history. His name was Richard," she continued, stirring her tea with careful precision. "Charming, ambitious, everything a young woman thinks she wants. We were married for 3 years before I discovered he'd been using my trust fund to finance his girlfriend's struggling boutique. He'd convinced me to put his name on everything, said it was what married couples do." "Mom, I had no idea," I whispered, the parallel to my own experience making my chest tighten. "I was 25 and thought I knew everything about love," she said, her eyes reflecting the past pain. "The morning I found out, the primal part of me wanted to burn his clothes on the lawn, scream at him in front of his colleagues, make sure everyone knew what kind of man he was." "What did you do?" I asked, my voice barely a thread. "I documented everything quietly, carefully," she replied. Then I served him divorce papers at his girlfriend's boutique grand opening, in front of all their investors. Richard lost both the woman and his credibility with the investors in one afternoon. The boutique closed within 6 months. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I met your father 2 years later. By then, I knew the difference between charm and character. The best revenge is living well while they live with their choices. You're already doing that. Anya, you protected your structure. The validation I hadn't known I desperately needed washed over me. A quiet, powerful flood of solidarity. My attorney, Miss Sterling, confirmed the legal finality 2 months later. Marcus's attempts to challenge the asset offset were quickly dismissed, given the overwhelming evidence of his corporate theft. He lost any claim to the appreciation value of the house, was required to pay a portion of my legal fees, and faced the humiliation of having the details of his fraud publicly filed in the court records. 6 months after that final drive, I hosted my first major dinner party in the newly reclaimed house. I had spent the intervening months engaged in a profound act of self-reclamation. I hadn't changed the walls or the layout drastically, but I had subtly redesigned the spaces Marcus had frequented, making them undeniably mine. I replaced the oversized masculine leather sofa he insisted upon with a sleek, custom chaise lounge and converted his small, messy den into a refined library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Every item, every finish, now reflected only my choices, my vision. The house felt lighter, cleaner, the air purged of his empty promises. My friends gathered, their laughter filling the high-ceiling spaces he had once taken for granted. Maria, my closest confidant, raised her glass as we gathered in the living room after dinner. "A toast," she announced, "to Anya, who showed us all that sometimes the best response to betrayal isn't to burn everything down, but to redesign the entire structure and leave the thief nothing but the clothes on his back." We clinked glasses, the sound crystalline in my peaceful home. I stood there, looking out the window at the city lights, and finally understood the profound philosophy of my actions. The revenge I sought was never about malice, it was about precision, legality, and complete emotional detachment. Marcus was not destroyed by my hatred. He was utterly demolished by the unshakable logic of his own documented financial failures and his catastrophic miscalculation of my resolve. My greatest satisfaction was not in seeing him suffer, but in the profound, quiet clarity of knowing that my life, my work, and my worth were finally and completely my own, built upon a foundation of logic, independence, and dignity that he could never touch again. This story reminds us that true power lies not in fiery anger, but in cold, calm precision. When faced with betrayal, the victory is never about destroying others. It's about protecting the structure of your own value. Emotional chaos is easy. Choosing logic, independence, and precise justice is the real measure of strength. Your self-worth is the only foundation that cannot be stolen. The moment you stop seeking external validation and build your own truth, you realize the most beautiful revenge is a life elegantly and completely redesigned. Thank you for joining us for this journey. If this story resonated with you, let us know in the comments below. What is the one truth you refuse to let anyone steal? Please like and subscribe for more surprising tales of resilience and unwavering dignity.